Alright, welcome back. So what I want to show in this chapter is how to model out some high poly geometry and bake it down to normal maps. But real quick before we get into that, I just want to show you, as a continuation from the last chapter, the end result of stitching the building on the right and cleaning up the geometry. I realized that I didn't show you that in the last chapter, so we'll just go ahead and do it right now. So what we're looking at here is the original non-cleaned up version. And if we compare that to the cleaned up version, you can see that the cleaned up one is stitched together nicely. There's no black faces, meaning that none of the verts are hidden. And now, just like we did with the building on the left, this piece has a lot more flexibility and it will light a lot nicer. So let's go ahead and just put those in their own layer. And what we're going to do to start this chapter is create a plane. We'll just make a little 4 unit by 4 unit plane. And the purpose of this plane is, this is what we're going to use to bake these high poly pieces down to. Meaning this plane will be kind of like a set of UVs. And after we do a bunch of high poly modeling, we'll use that to transfer the high poly details to a flat plane. And if that doesn't make a lot of sense right now, don't worry, by the end of this chapter it will. So before I explain how we're doing this, I should probably explain why we're doing this. We have a limited amount of polygons that we can use in our scene, and for little details like bolts and vents and stuff like that, it might not make sense to model it. It probably makes more sense to make really high polygon pieces and bake them down to normal maps so that we can use them in texturing. And then later on, instead of having to model out a bolt and put it on there, we can just do it in texture. And we'll have these pre-made in a normal map. And so when we go to do the texturing, we can just kind of pull these onto our normal map, and using overlay and soft light and stuff like that, we can add these in as additional detail instead of having to model it all out ahead of time. So it's just a smart workflow, especially when doing sci-fi stuff where there's a lot of, vents and bolts and stuff like that. So you would be correct in calling this a texturing task, actually. But since we have to do this modeling to create the texturing, I'm including it on this DVD. And so, in short, the reason why I'm doing this is just to create a high-res page of normal map details that I can place on my geometry later on instead of having to do it through using polygons. Now, as for how I'm doing this, is I'm using the proxy modeling techniques that I showed in a previous chapter. So if you've forgotten, I will refresh your memory a little bit. Basically, I'm using a couple tools. I'm using the crease tool under the proxy menu to determine where I'm getting kind of a hard edge instead of using hard edges. I'm using the insert edge loops tool to add additional tessellation. And then I'm smoothing everything down by hitting 1, 2, and 3 on the keyboard. 1 being the low polygon shell, and 2 being a simulation of what the high poly rendering would look like. So starting with this new detail here, I'll kind of walk you through my process. I'm going to go ahead and select every other edge, extrude those edges, and then create a new curve out of that edge just to kind of bevel that back a little bit. Same thing for the inner edge. I want to stay away from 90-degree edges here since we're going to bake it down to a flat plane. And now we're inserting some edge loops just to kind of take away the softness of some of the edges. Remember, you can also do that using page up and page down, which I'm not showing you right now just because it has a tendency to lock up the computer. So we'll do this the other way, where we manually add some cuts. But page up, page down is a much better way to do if your computer can handle it. So adding some cuts here, just so that these edges don't appear so soft when we hit 3 on the keyboard to smooth them. And I'm stealing this little bolt detail and kind of smash it down. Go ahead and adjust its pivot point so that we can ring it around the edge here. And then I'm going to select this inner edge and bevel it to create a double edge. And then insert another edge loop in there and kind of pull it out just to give me a nice rounded detail there. And there you go. I've created a nice little surface part that we can put onto a texture, and it'll give us some nice surface detail. So moving on, let's do another one. I'm shooting for maybe 6 or 8 of these. This one I want to be more of a vent. So starting out with a box, I just pushed and pulled some points to make kind of a vent system here. Go ahead and duplicate it a couple times and then center it on this object. Fit that a little bit better. With pieces like this, I'm not worried about being ultra precise because these will just be baked down to a texture. So I'm not going to make sure that everything's stitched together or anything like that. Here it's totally about the composition of the piece and how it looks pretty much just front on. So right now I'm going to extrude these faces up here and then crease the edges that I want to be hard. Really don't need any of these faces in the back, so I really could delete them if I wanted to. Insert some edge loops, do some more near the edge here to kind of tighten that up. And then run a bevel on it and then crease the edges of that bevel. Go ahead and delete these back faces. They're not getting us anything. At times, using this proxy modeling, edges that you've set to be creased sometimes will kind of become degenerate, and you'll find that you'll be creasing the same edges over and over. I'm not sure exactly why that happens, but it seems like sometimes when you're adding additional cuts using the cut faces tool or using the insert edge loops tool, it gets a little bit confused. So that's one of the downsides, is sometimes edges that you've set to be creased need to be recreased over and over, especially if you duplicate things. So you can see right there I had to do that. I made a cut, and in doing so it deleted my crease edge, and I just had to recrease it. Kind of a pain in the neck, but you know, no software is perfect. So continuing on here, I'm going to create another little detail piece. I'll go ahead and insert some edge loops there. Push the face back and just take all the edges and crease them all, just to kind of see where we're sitting. And then we add another edge loop just to kind of tighten that up. With a lot of these pieces, I kind of don't have a vision ahead of time what they're going to be. It's more just kind of playing with the shapes, inserting some cuts in there, and I don't know, just kind of goofing around. This kind of modeling for me is pretty liberating compared to what we've been doing so far in this DVD, where we've had to be very precise. You know, this could really be kind of a mess. It just has to look right and render right. And so what I'm doing right now is something that's referred to as a floater. Since I'm going to bake this down just to a flat plane, I can do some details that don't really even have to be part of the mesh. So this little guy will just be floating on top. It's not really stitched in. It'll give the illusion that it's kind of pushed back or recessed a little bit, but it's actually not. It's sitting on top of the geometry and floating there. But when we bake the normal map, it'll look like, you know, it's embedded in the face. And that's what's cool about this kind of modeling. It doesn't have to be right. This one just has to look right. Since we're just going to end up baking it down to a texture, everything can be floating, nothing has to be stitched. The polygon count doesn't really matter. In fact, the more polygons the better, really. And making little details like this is kind of a smart way to go, because in texturing we could, once we bake these down to a normal map, render out an ambient occlusion map, we could combine these into a million different little textures. And especially if you're working on something futuristic or science fiction, having a library of parts like this will just make your work that much faster. And it'll give everything kind of a consistent look, and you'll be able to whip up a bunch of textures really fast. So this last piece down here is the most complicated of all the detail pieces I'm making. So just to let you know what I'm doing. Taking the face and doing extrusion and then scaling in the extrusion. Making a few cuts and then beveling the cuts just to double up the edge. And then a few more extrusions, clean it up with the split polygon tool. and just seeing how it smooths, and then going in and creasing all the edges. The more you do this, the more you'll get used to understanding how the crease tool works. But the best workflow is to just continue to crease edges and then smooth it down and just kind of see what you're getting. So I'm going to delete the bottom half here just so I can duplicate it and not have to do all that work again. That's kind of a nice little vent thing. It almost looks like a smoke detector. That's what happens, I guess, when you kind of make it up as you go along. Sometimes things start looking like other things. But I like how this thing works. I know in this DVD I didn't go over the details of how the hotbox works. But a lot of things that are found up in the menus can be accessed quicker by mapping them to the hotbox. And you can just go to the Maya help to explain how to do that. It's very easy. But by hitting the space bar, that'll bring up the Maya hotbox, and there's all kinds of ways you can customize it. So a lot of times you'll see a menu pop up in the middle of the screen with commands that you know are up in the menu set, like extrude, extrude edge, harden edge, soften edge. I've gone ahead and mapped those all to the Maya hotbox. So if you want to know how to adjust your Maya hotbox, customize it for how you want to work, there's a lot of tutorials online, or you can just kind of poke around in the Maya preferences. There's a section for hotbox. Another pro tip would be to use hotkeys wherever possible. For example, I've mapped the crease tool to a hotkey because certain functions are a pain in the neck to have to go find up in the menu every time, especially when it's something repetitive. And that's the cool thing about Maya, it's really customizable. So I've just about finished up the modeling here, and I just did something really important. I went to the top view and I kind of made sure that all these pieces were sitting along the same plane. Since we're going to go ahead and bake these down to a flat piece, we want them to all be, roughly sitting the same distance away from the plane we're going to bake to. But before we bake these down, we have to convert them to higher polygon objects, and you do that in the subdivision proxy function under the proxy tab. And what you do is you adjust the division levels, and you can click apply. And what it will do is create a new piece of geometry based on your proxy modeling that is just a ton of polygons. And so what I'm going to do now is just start selecting all of my proxy models, and I'm going to hit G, which in Maya is the hotkey for redo last command. And I'm just going to start selecting my proxy models here and converting them all to high poly objects. And if you're wondering why I'm not just selecting all the objects at once and then converting them to higher polygon objects, the reason is I did that once and Maya froze. So I'm just kind of doing them one by one. Not totally efficient, but I know I won't lose any work. And now I'm grabbing each piece and assigning it just to a layer. That way I can quickly hide and unhide my proxy models and high poly objects, just because I don't want them both turned on at the same time. I highly suggest using the Maya layer system. I know I haven't gone over it a whole lot, but I do use it all the time. Pretty much everything I make will go into some layer so that the scene doesn't get very cluttered and I can manage all my pieces. So now that I've done that, it's time to actually bake these things down to a texture. So the first thing I got to do is kind of expand this square a little bit, just so that everything fits. So I'm going to do a little rearranging here, just to get everything on the same texture page. Fit it as good as possible. Leave some room in case I want to make more of these later. I'm not too worried about the layout being totally perfect and the spacing being perfect, because this is not going to be its own texture. Remember, this is just going to be a texture to help create other textures in the future. Alright, so now we have everything pretty well set up. We've hidden the original proxy modeling, and we're left with just our polygon pieces. Double checking that all these are in the correct layers. And we're ready to take these high polygon pieces and bake them down. So what we got to do is go to the Rendering tab, Lighting and Shading, and open up the Transfer Maps option. And so the way this works is first we select our low poly geometry and add that to the target mesh. And then we select all the high polygon pieces and add them to the source meshes. We go ahead and click the normal map tab, and we choose what kind of texture we want to render this out to. We're going to say a targa file, and we'll just specify where to put it. Doesn't really matter what you name it, as long as you can find it. And we want to be in tangent space, not object space. The next thing I'm going to do here is go to the Maya common output and determine what size texture we want to render. Right now I'm just going to do a 1024 by 1024, and we'll set the sampling quality to preview just so that it goes fast. And the last thing I'm going to do, which is an important one here, is adjust the max search depth so that the rays go a little bit farther, and this will assure that no details get dropped out when we render the normal map. And now I'm taking the plane and just pulling that in front of all the objects and hitting the bake button. Now sometimes these can take a while to bake, but I really don't have a lot of geometry here, so this should go pretty quickly. And we're done. And now the next thing to do is map this onto a material so we can actually look at it. So the next step is to open up your Hypershade, and I'm just going to make a blend material, and then drag that onto the face here, and then we want to double click the material and go to the bump mapping tab. This will give us the option to create a new rendered node, and we'll choose the file option, and we will just browse and find that normal map. And then once you do that, you can go up to the filter type and turn off some of the different filters that are happening. We'll just leave it on quadratic for now. And then we want to use this as a tangent space normal map. And that's it. I've done it. Go ahead and turn off the Hypershade here. And the last thing we want to do is go up to the render tab and turn on high quality rendering so we can see the results. Evaluating this right now, looking at the texture, I can see that some of the edges are a little bit jagged, but remember when we rendered this I used the low quality setting just to make it go fast. If I was to turn on all the bells and whistles, we would get rid of all of that. For a more final version of this too, I probably would have rendered it as a 2048 just to have the highest possible size as well. So let's go ahead and turn on the pieces and then just move this out of the way just so we can compare. And right now there's 500,000 triangles in the scene, and while textures do take up some memory and performance as well, there's no way we could have had 500,000 triangles in the scene to get these higher poly details in. And so that's where normal maps and texturing comes into play. And so that's about it for this chapter. Hopefully that all made sense and will help you in the future.